Assalamu alaikum, viewers at home. You are still watching Prime Live and welcome back from the ad break. We do know that the National Assembly Speaker Thokozile this afternoon postponed Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's budget speech to the 12th of March. Now, this unusual development came as a result of concerns around certain proposals, including the increase in value-added tax. Now, what does this all mean for government spending for the year ahead? And will the emergency meeting called by President Ramaphosa solve the deadlock? Now, I am joined by Thokozile Madonko, who is the researcher at the Public Economy Project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the WITS University. Good evening, Thokozile. Thank you so much for joining us on Prime Live.
Good evening and good evening to your viewers.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to jump straight into it. First of all, we have never seen this before, and many South Africans are confused and worried about what this actually means. Are the concerns raised by political parties in Parliament actually valid?
The concerns are valid. It isn't pleasant to have a situation where, routine, everybody loves routine and likes things happening as they should happen. And for as long as I've been doing my political, economy work, the budget has happened in February. So it is, a little bit disheartening to see that the Government of National Unity was not able to iron out their differences prior to the pomp and ceremony of the budget speech today.
So now this is the first budget speech by a government of national unity. Can we draw similarities with how they handle budgets and what has happened today?
So previously we've had essentially a ruling party. And so the literature on our budget process has been fairly, in consensus around the fact that the budget being tabled in Parliament has been merely a rubber stamping, and that where there has been horse trading, it's often happened in the hallways of the ANC itself or between its alliance partners. And so, the horse trading wouldn't necessarily play out in the public domain. Now, it's very normal for coalition governments to do things very differently. And so perhaps we were a little bit naive to expect the budget today to be tabled in the same way as having the ruling party. We don't have a ruling party. We have a Government of National Unity, which is essentially a coalition government. And so, disagreements and pressures from their individual party bases means that sometimes that spills out into the public, which has happened today.
So in terms of what the minister will table in March, one of the major fiscal challenges facing South Africa is the very high debt to GDP ratio, which is around 74%. How do you expect the minister to address this, and why is it a ticking time bomb?
So I'd like to disagree with you a little bit to say that our debt to GDP ratio is actually not an alarming thing. It's been blown out of proportion. There are countries like Japan and the US that have a debt to GDP ratio over 100%, if not more. I think Japan is over 200%. So our debt to GDP ratio is not an alarming thing. What is alarming is our growth. And so we get concerned about debt to GDP because we get concerned about our GDP. So is our GDP growing? So if our GDP is growing, our gross domestic product, so all the things that we produce in the economy starts growing, then the share of the debt, is manageable because we're growing over time, sort of compounding interest in a way. So the issue for the minister was that he is tabling a budget that is essentially a budget that is an austere budget. They use the term fiscal consolidation. I use the term austerity, which means budget cuts. And often what happens with budget cuts and austerity budgeting is that you cut the size of the state and essentially the role of the state in the economy. So our industrial policy gets hit in terms of what role the state can play in driving economic activity. And so when you have those kinds of cuts and the state is no longer playing a role in the economy, then it's unlikely that we're going to see growth, because the assumption is that the private sector will take its place, and that through innovation and sort of very neoliberal kind of wishy-washy trickle-down economics, that everything will magically become better and we will all be prosperous. Now, we've been pursuing fiscal consolidation since 2012, and our growth has not improved. And in fact, our debt to GDP ratio has gotten worse. And so we are seeing a situation where we have a hollowing out of the state, the inability of the state to deliver services, and we're beginning to feel it. These cuts, we feel them at a very, in our neighborhoods, when the water pipe bursts and nobody fixes it, when we've got potholes in the roads, when the lights go out. So this is something that we experience when there's huge classes and too few teachers. Our nurses are rude and overworked. Because they're overworked, they're rude. So the pressure is there, and we feel these cuts. And so what happens is, by focusing purely on stabilizing debt, which is what they're doing, they're not looking at the other story, which is to focus on growth. And that we need to essentially stop believing this magical thinking that growth is going to happen by cutting the state. That's not going to happen. The research is very clear globally. In Greece, when they had the cut, it hurt their economy. When they had austerity, it hurt their economy. Their suicide rates went up, their HIV rates went up, their health outcomes went down. So it has a very, very bad impact. And there are winners and losers with austere budgeting. And the winners are usually the creditors, the people who own the debt, because the interest rates continue to stay relatively high through inflation targeting. And then you have a situation where you are able to get more for your debt than you would have if the environment was managed differently.
Just to expand more on what we're speaking about, do you think we can actually afford to reduce social spending while we continue to have unemployment or high unemployment?
Absolutely not. So what I'm arguing is that our budget that has been tabled, and of course we haven't seen the one that was going to be tabled today, so we don't know, what radical changes might have been on the table. But essentially, if we go on what was presented in October, the medium-term budget policy statement, which was a government of national unity policy statement, we see that it is not growth-friendly, that it doesn't have an employment-friendly lens, and it isn't public service delivery friendly either. So we see that capital spending is likely to be 30% lower in real terms compared to 2017. And what does that mean? That means we're not repairing roads, we're not repairing clinics, we're not putting new toilets in schools that should have decent toilets as opposed to pit latrines. So when we cut capital expenditure, we're cutting jobs. So I'm very, very, and I get very heated about this, is that public jobs are good jobs. There's no separate labor market for the state or for government. Those jobs mean that those people are able to engage economically and are able to participate in the economy. They are participants in the economy. We have one labor force. And so if you cut the jobs in the government, it doesn't mean that they're going to magically appear in the private sector. It just means you've cut those jobs. And that means fewer people paying tax, fewer people engaging in the economy. And so over time, you're going to slow demand in the economy. What do I mean by demand? Basically, do you have 100 Rand in your pocket to be able to spend and participate in the economy? That's demand, to go and buy the things that you want. And so we see that under austere budgeting or austerity budgeting, that if you cut social services, which in the long term harm everybody, everyone gets harmed by cutting social services, because all your indicators go down. And education should be our up front and center priority, to make sure that not only are our young people and our next generation are being educated, but we make sure that they have food in their bellies when they go to school. So we should have a comprehensive school nutrition program. We should make sure that those families that are vulnerable and are not able to access employment access support from the state in the form of grants. So the child support grant becomes absolutely critical, and not just to have it at the level that it is now, but to have it at a higher level, the lower food poverty line, so that families are able to feed themselves, so that they are not going to school hungry. These are the kinds of priorities that we should be hearing out of the minister when he tables his speech, not our debt to DG ratio. That should be, page 22. And right up front, he should be telling us what it is that they're doing about employment, and about poverty, about hunger, because that's a huge issue in our society, and making sure that we are doing things in the economy as the state to drive innovation and to then encourage the private sector to play its part.
That's actually a very a good way of looking at it. The fact that you mentioned that cutting, social spending isn't necessarily going to, what do you call this, reduce any high in unemployment. In fact, it's going to make it worse. That's a beautiful way of looking at it. So now lots of people are looking forward to what the budget will do for state-owned enterprises. Why is investment in these SOEs important for economic growth?
So the two main ones that I'm going to focus on, because there's over 200 of them, but the ones that we are interested in because they played an absolutely critical role in the growth of our economy and the development of this country is Eskom and Transnet. And so we see that making sure, and we shouldn't be talking about bailout, because these are entities that are absolutely critical to our structural nature of our economy. The provision of energy, both to the private sector as well as to the households, to energy. We have a huge energy poverty issue in this country, so we should be providing available free basic services for households so that they can participate in the economy, and lighting and energy is one of those things, so they can cook food and they can study at night. So, and Transnet is about making sure that we take what we have, that we are making and building and developing in this country, and get it out in terms of trade. And so that we are able to leverage what resources we do have and make good use of those resources and enable them to get out in efficient and fast ways. So, of course, corruption is a huge issue. I'm not saying that corruption is not a problem, inefficiencies are not a problem, but we should be jumping around, saying this is our Eskom, this is our Transnet, and we need them to function if we are going to survive as a nation, because if Eskom falls, we all fall.
We do also know that economic growth has averaged around 1% for about a decade now. What do you think? I know that you covered that a little bit in the beginning of our conversation, but I just want you to expand more on that. What does the budget need to do to ensure an environment is actually created to ensure that business does well enough so that we can actually employ people? Where do we start?
So I worked with a colleague, and we did some research with some researchers, academics in the UK on this. And it's to take us back to some old world thinking, and it's, Keynesian thinking. And it's about saying that we have a particular understanding of the state. And the state, this understanding of the state is one in which it is involved in the economy, and it's also involved in the welfare of its citizens. And so one of the mechanisms that the state can do is it can leverage its power to be able to say, we will invest in infrastructure, both physical infrastructure as in Eskom, Transnet, making sure we've got railway lines, making sure they're maintained, making sure we're extending the grid, making sure we're providing accessible, cheap, green energy, environmentally sustainable energy. And also in social infrastructure. So the feminist economic talks about social infrastructure, which is often in the sort of World Bank, IMF circles, is critiqued as being an expense, but is in fact an investment. When you invest in education, teachers, schools, school buildings, the maintenance people for the schools, all that goes into, maintaining education, health, the same thing. The same thing for housing. When we start, and public transport, if we start investing in those, then that will give confidence to the private sector to come to the table and start investing themselves. So if government is not investing, why would the private sector invest? If government is not saying, here, we are willing to put capital infrastructure in place, would the private sector then come to the party? You know, it's in terms of the kind of post World War II consensus, it was seen as illogical. That wasn't going to happen. So we have to debunk this thinking and say that actually we need to defend our state and we have to defend public jobs and defend the role that the state then plays in the economy and ensuring that we can then see growth, because those multiplier effects are tenfold. And we have, you know, enormous examples. The Scandinavian countries, all of these countries have done these things in terms of really talking about industrial policy and the role of industrial policy, which is really just the role of the state in the economy, and leveraging and opening up spaces for economic innovation. And, you know, so if we get the lights on all the time, as we've seen, there's more confidence. If we get our education system where we're producing graduates that are not having to go on hunger strike for housing when those should be provided to them, then, you know, then our educational outcomes can be better, and can, you know, we can deliver the employees that are needed for the private sector to flourish.
That was such an insightful conversation that we had. Thokozile, thank you so much for joining us. I guess we'll have to wait for the 12th of March just to see exactly what to expect. But thank you so much for all the information that you have shared.
So much, and thanks to your viewers. Have a good evening.
You too, thank you. Viewers at home, that was Thokozile, and this was such an insightful and very informative conversation. I mean, seeing the way she has interpreted, you know, a lot of things, and how she actually looks at it, it was very interesting and quite insightful. But without wasting any time, we're going to take a quick ad break. We will see you right after this, so stay tuned.